The volcanic sand beneath Marine Private First Class Johnny Martinez's boots felt like walking on broken glass mixed with coal dust as his landing craft approached the black beaches of Iwo Jima on the morning of February 19, 1945. The 20-year-old from Texas had no way of knowing he was about to step onto what would become known as the most savagely contested piece of real estate in the Pacific Theater. The island stretched before the assault force like a malformed pork chop, 8 square miles of volcanic rock and sulfur springs that reeked of hell itself. Mount Suribachi, the dormant volcano that dominated the southern tip, loomed like a dark sentinel over the approaching fleet. What the Marines couldn't see from their landing craft were the 22,000 Japanese defenders who had spent months turning every cave, every ridge, every grain of volcanic sand into a death trap. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had arrived on Iwo Jima in June of 1944, with orders that would have seemed impossible to any other. Commander, hold the island at all costs. Unlike previous Pacific battles where Japanese forces had charged headlong into American firepower, Kuribayashi implemented a radically different strategy. He would make the Americans pay for every yard with blood. The Japanese commander had overseen the construction of an underground fortress system that defied imagination. 11 miles of tunnels connected over 1,500 cave positions, pillboxes, and bunkers. Some tunnels plunged 5 stories underground, complete with hospitals, ammunition storage, and command centers. The volcanic rock that made digging so difficult also made the fortifications nearly impervious to bombardment, as referenced in historian James Bradley's comprehensive account. In Flags of Our Fathers, the pre-invasion bombardment had been the most intensive in Pacific War history, yet it barely scratched the surface of Kuribayashi's underground empire. Major General Harry Schmidt's 5th Amphibious Corps, consisting of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions, represented the largest Marine force ever assembled for a single operation. 68,000 Marines would assault an island defended by an enemy who had no intention of retreating, no expectation of survival, and no plan beyond making the Americans pay the highest possible price. The first wave hit the beaches at 900 hours. For the first hour, the landing proceeded with an eerie calm that fooled no one. Veterans of Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan knew that silence from Japanese positions meant only one thing. They were walking into a trap. Martinez stumbled up the steep volcanic slope, his gear weighing him down as the loose sand shifted beneath every step. The beach rose at a 45-degree angle, making movement exhausting and coordinated attacks nearly impossible. Behind him, landing craft continued to pour men and equipment onto the narrow beaches, creating a concentration of targets that any artillery observer would find irresistible. At 10:30 hours, the trap was sprung. The volcanic island erupted in a symphony of death as thousands of concealed Japanese positions opened fire. Simultaneously, mortars, artillery, machine guns, and rifles poured devastating fire into the crowded beachhead. The black sand that had been difficult to walk on now became a nightmare as Marines tried to dig foxholes in volcanic grit that refused to hold its shape. The battle for Iwo Jima had begun, and already the island was demanding its payment in blood. By the end of the first day, the Marines had learned a terrible truth about their enemy. This would not be a battle of charges and countercharges, of heroic advances and dramatic breakthroughs. This would be a battle of inches, where every cave had to be cleared, every bunker destroyed, every tunnel sealed with the lives of young Americans who had never imagined warfare could be so intimate and so brutal. Sergeant Mike O'Brien of the 28th Marines had fought at Guadalcanal, but nothing had prepared him for the labyrinthine horror of Iwo Jima. His squad approached a seemingly innocent mound of volcanic rock, only to discover it concealed a multi-level bunker system with interlocking fields of fire. The Japanese had positioned their defensive works so that attacking one position exposed the attackers to devastating crossfire from others. The innovation of Kuribayashi's defensive strategy became horrifyingly apparent as the Marines advanced. Traditional tactics of suppressing enemy positions with artillery and airstrikes proved almost useless against an enemy who could disappear into the earth itself. A position that had been pounded by naval gunfire for hours would suddenly spring to life, with deadly accurate fire. Manned by defenders who had waited out the bombardment in deep underground shelters, flamethrowers became the weapon of choice for the Marines, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. The Japanese positions were so well constructed that only the terrifying reach of jellied gasoline could force defenders from their caves. Private First Class Tony Delacroix from Louisiana became expert with the flamethrower, though the weapon made him a priority target for Japanese snipers who recognized its tactical importance. The Japanese had prepared for this moment with meticulous care. Every defensive position had been surveyed for range and deflection. Mortar crews had pre-plotted targets on likely avenues of approach. Machine gun positions had been carefully camouflaged and positioned to create overlapping fields of fire that would channel attacking forces into predetermined kill zones. As documented in Robert Sherrod's wartime reporting for Time magazine, the Japanese had even calculated the psychological impact of their defensive strategy, knowing that the slow, grinding nature of cave-to-cave fighting would exact a tremendous toll on American morale. Colonel Harry Liversedge's 28th Marines had drawn the assignment of capturing Mount Suribachi, the extinct volcano that dominated the island's southern approach. The mountain appeared to be a single, massive fortress, honeycombed with caves and tunnels that allowed defenders to appear and disappear like deadly phantoms. Every advance up the mountain's slope was met with a hail of fire from positions that seemed to materialize from the volcanic rock itself. The Marines developed new tactics born of desperation and necessity. Small teams would approach suspected cave entrances, while others provided covering fire. Engineers would place demolition charges to seal caves, often while under intense fire from other positions. The process was slow, dangerous, and utterly exhausting, but it was the only way to make progress against an enemy who refused to show himself. Weather became another enemy. The volcanic ash mixed with intermittent rain to create a gray paste that clung to everything. Equipment jammed, visibility decreased, and the already difficult terrain became even more treacherous. Marines found themselves fighting not just the Japanese, but the island itself, which seemed determined to resist. Every step of their advance. By the fourth day, the Marines had established a tenuous foothold, but casualties were mounting at an alarming rate. The island was already claiming its payment in blood, and the worst was yet to come. The assault on Mount Suribachi had become a matter of Marine Corps' pride. The extinct volcano, rising 546 feet above the landing beaches, served as an observation post for Japanese artillery spotters who could direct devastating fire onto the crowded beachheads below. Every Marine on the island understood that Suribachi had to be taken, but none could have imagined the cost. Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson's 1st Battalion, 28th Marines, had been fighting for 3 days to reach the base of the mountain. Each yard of advance required clearing dozens of cave positions, many of which were connected by tunnels that allowed Japanese defenders to reappear in positions that had supposedly been cleared. The volcanic rock that formed the mountain was so hard that artillery shells often bounced off without exploding, while the porous nature of the stone absorbed much of the explosive force that did detonate. Corporal Tony Stein from Dayton, Ohio, had already distinguished himself in the fighting around Suribachi. Armed with a modified aircraft machine gun he had nicknamed Stinger, Stein had single-handedly eliminated numerous Japanese positions. His aggressive tactics and seemingly reckless courage had made him a legend among his fellow Marines, though he paid little attention to such things. Like most Marines on Iwo Jima, Stein was focused entirely on the immediate task of staying alive while eliminating the enemy. The Japanese defenders of Suribachi had been handpicked by Kuribayashi for their fanatical devotion and fighting skill. They had spent months preparing positions that maximized the mountain's natural defensive advantages. Cave entrances were positioned to be invisible from below, while firing ports were carefully camouflaged to blend with the dark volcanic rock. The defenders had stockpiled ammunition, food, and water for an extended siege, fully expecting to die in defense of their positions. On February 23rd, After 4 days of brutal fighting, a patrol from Easy Company reached the summit of Suribachi. The Marines had expected to find a final, desperate battle at the top, but instead discovered that the surviving Japanese defenders had withdrawn to deeper positions within the mountain. The summit was theirs, but the victory felt hollow given the cost in lives. As referenced in Joe Rosenthal's Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph for the Associated Press, the flag raising on Mount Suribachi would become one of the most iconic images of the Second World War. Though few understood the complexity of the moment it captured, the first flag raised on Suribachi was small and barely visible from the beaches below. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson, recognizing the symbolic importance of the moment, ordered a larger flag to be raised so that every Marine on the island could see it. It was this second flag raising that photographer Joe Rosenthal captured in his famous image, showing 6 Marines struggling to plant the stars and stripes in the volcanic soil. The flag raising provided a tremendous morale boost to the Marines fighting on the beaches below, but it marked only the beginning of their ordeal. Mount Suribachi represented less than 10% of the island's total area, and the Japanese had concentrated their strongest defenses in the northern sectors, where the terrain was even more favorable to the defenders. Sergeant Michael Strank, one of the Marines who helped raise the flag, understood better than most that the capture of Suribachi was merely the first act in a much longer and bloodier drama. The 24-year-old squad leader from Pennsylvania had already seen enough combat to know that the Japanese would make the Marines pay for every remaining inch of the island. The flag on Suribachi waved in the sulphurous wind, a symbol of American determination that could be seen across the entire island. But beneath the surface, in the tunnels and caves that honeycombed the volcanic rock, thousands of Japanese defenders prepared for the next phase of the battle, knowing that they would sell their lives as dearly as possible. With Mount Suribachi secured, the full weight of the Marine assault turned northward toward the island's most formidable defenses. The terrain ahead presented challenges that made the fight for Suribachi seem like a warm-up exercise. The northern two-thirds of Iwo Jima consisted of a series of ridges, ravines, and plateaus that the Japanese had transformed into a defensive maze of unprecedented complexity. Major General Graves Erskine's 3rd Marine Division had joined the battle, bringing the total American force to over 70,000 men packed onto an island barely 8 square miles in area. The concentration of forces created logistical nightmares as supplies, ammunition, and medical facilities competed for space on the narrow beaches. Still under intermittent Japanese fire, the Japanese had organized their northern defenses around what they called the Motoyama Plateau, a relatively flat area that contained 2 of the island's 3 airfields. American planners had expected these airfields to be the primary objectives, but Kuribayashi had prepared a surprise. Rather than defending the airfields directly, he had positioned his strongest forces in the ridges and hills that overlooked them, creating a series of killing fields that would channel attacking forces into predetermined zones of destruction. Private First Class Franklin Sousley from Kentucky found himself part of the assault on Hill 362A, a nondescript rise that concealed one of the most sophisticated defensive positions on the island. The hill appeared to be nothing more than another volcanic mound, but Japanese engineers had spent months carving firing positions, command bunkers, and living quarters into its interior. The entire hill was essentially a fortress disguised as natural terrain. The fighting for Hill 362A exemplified the brutal nature of the Iwo Jima campaign. Marines would assault a position under devastating fire, capture it after suffering heavy casualties, only to discover that the position was connected by tunnels to other defensive works. Japanese defenders would allow the Marines to occupy the surface positions, then emerge from hidden entrances to attack from behind. The psychological strain of never knowing when or where the next attack would come began to wear on even the most experienced veterans. Lieutenant Colonel Justice Chambers, 3rd Battalion, 25th Marines, had been fighting for 6 days straight when they encountered what would become known as the amphitheater, a natural depression that the Japanese had turned into a killing field. The bowl-shaped terrain feature was surrounded by concealed positions, that provided interlocking fields of fire, making it virtually impossible to cross without sustaining massive casualties. As reported in Ernie Pyle's dispatch to Scripps Howard newspapers, the fighting had taken on a character unlike anything seen in previous Pacific battles, with both sides locked in a death struggle that seemed to have no end. The Japanese tactics were evolving as well. Korebayashi had forbidden the traditional banzai charges that had characterized earlier battles, instead emphasizing disciplined fire and movement designed to inflict maximum casualties on the attackers. Japanese defenders would fire a few rounds from one position, then move through the tunnel system to another firing point, creating the impression of a much larger force, while making it difficult for American forces to locate and destroy individual positions. Marine casualties were mounting at an alarming rate. Medical corpsmen like pharmacist's mate third-class John Bradley found themselves overwhelmed by the constant stream of wounded Marines requiring evacuation. The volcanic ash that covered everything made treating wounds particularly difficult, as the gritty material infected even minor injuries and interfered with bandaging. The advance north had become a test of endurance as much as courage. Marines were fighting not just the Japanese, but exhaustion, fear, and the gradual erosion of their combat effectiveness. Units that had landed at full strength were now operating at half capacity, with survivors carrying the burden of their fallen comrades while facing an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Every ridge conquered revealed another ridge beyond it, each more heavily defended than the last. The island was exacting its payment in blood, and the final reckoning was still to come. By the first week of March, the battle for Iwo Jima had devolved into a nightmarish struggle that tested the limits of human endurance. The Marines had been fighting for 2 weeks straight, advancing yard by yard through defenses that seemed to regenerate themselves overnight. The Japanese had created a defensive system so complex and interlocking that destroying one position often revealed two more, each more deadly than the last. Staff Sergeant Woody Williams from West Virginia had become legendary among his fellow Marines for his work with the flamethrower. The compact, soft-spoken Marine had single-handedly eliminated dozens of Japanese positions, often advancing alone under heavy fire to get close enough to use his weapon effectively. His courage had become the stuff of legend, though Williams himself seemed oblivious to the attention, focusing entirely on the immediate task of keeping his squad alive. The Japanese defenders had adapted their tactics to counter American advantages in firepower and air support. They had learned to remain hidden during daylight hours, emerging only at night to reoccupy positions that had been cleared during the day. This forced the Marines to fight the same battles, repeatedly, never knowing if a position was truly secure or simply temporarily abandoned. The psychological toll was becoming as significant as the physical casualties. Marines who had survived the landing and the initial assault were beginning to show signs of combat fatigue, a condition that military psychiatrists were only beginning to understand. The constant noise of battle, the sulfurous smell of the volcanic island, and the sight of fallen comrades created a sensory overload that affected even the most experienced veterans. Captain Joseph McCarthy's Company G, 24th Marines, had been reduced to less than half strength after 10 days of continuous fighting. The company had started the battle with 240 Marines and was now operating with fewer than 100 effectives. Those who remained were held together by a combination of discipline, loyalty to their comrades, and the grim determination to finish what they had started. The Japanese had organized their defenses around a series of strong points that the Marines had nicknamed with typically dark humor. The meat grinder was a complex of ravines and ridges that seemed to consume entire companies without yielding significant ground. Turkey Knob was a hill that provided observation over a wide area, making it virtually impossible to approach during daylight hours. The amphitheater was a natural depression that had been turned into a killing field, where Japanese defenders could engage attacking forces from multiple directions simultaneously. Each of these positions required its own specialized tactics and techniques. The Marines had learned to combine flamethrowers, demolitions, and small unit tactics in ways that had never been taught in training. Innovation became a matter of survival as squad leaders developed new methods for clearing caves, sealing tunnels, and coordinating attacks against positions that seemed impregnable. As documented in Robert Sherrod's wartime reporting, the battle had taken on characteristics that distinguished it from every previous Pacific engagement, with both sides locked in a struggle that seemed to have no precedent in military history. The weather had turned against the Marines as well. Rain mixed with the volcanic ash to create a gray paste that clung to everything, making movement difficult and visibility poor. The combination of mud, blood, and volcanic grit created conditions that were almost medieval in their primitive horror. Marine engineers had begun using innovative techniques to deal with the Japanese cave systems. They would pump gasoline into cave entrances and ignite it, creating a devastating explosion that would collapse tunnel systems and eliminate multiple positions simultaneously. The technique was effective but dangerous, as the volatile fumes could ignite prematurely, killing the Marines attempting to use them. The Japanese were running low on supplies and ammunition, but this only made them more dangerous. Desperate defenders were more likely to emerge from their positions for close-quarters fighting, creating the kind of hand-to-hand combat that favored their superior knowledge of the terrain and their willingness to die rather than surrender. By March 10th, the battle for Iwo Jima had entered its final phase, though few participants realized it at the time. The Marines had fought for 3 weeks to advance less than 4 miles, paying a price in blood that shocked even veteran commanders who had witnessed the carnage of previous Pacific battles. The Japanese defensive system was finally beginning to crack, but like a wounded animal, it was becoming more dangerous as it weakened. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi had been forced to abandon his original plan of conducting the defense from prepared positions. American flamethrowers, demolitions, and innovative tactics had systematically eliminated his carefully constructed fortifications. The Japanese commander now found himself conducting a mobile defense, with the remnants of his garrison moving from position to position as the Marines gradually compressed his defensive perimeter. The final Japanese stronghold centered on a ridge system in the north-central portion of the island. The Marines had dubbed it Bloody Gorge, a name that accurately reflected the cost of approaching it. The ravine was approximately 700 yards long and 200 yards wide, with steep sides that provided excellent defensive positions and made coordinated attacks extremely difficult. Colonel Harry Liversedge's 28th Marines, veterans of the Suribachi assault, had been given the mission of reducing the final Japanese positions. The regiment had suffered severe casualties in the earlier fighting, and many of its original members had been evacuated as wounded or killed. The Marines who remained were held together by a combination of professional pride, unit cohesion, and the grim determination to finish what they had started. The Japanese defenders in Bloody Gorge represented the hardcore of Kuribayashi's garrison. These were the men who had survived 3 weeks of the most intensive combat in Pacific War history, and they had no intention of surrendering. They had prepared their final positions with the same meticulous care that had characterized the entire Japanese defense, creating a system of caves and tunnels that would extract the maximum price from their attackers. Private First Class Jacqueline Lucas from North Carolina had already distinguished himself in the fighting around the northern airfields. The 17-year-old Marine had lied about his age to enlist and had been fighting with the intensity of a much more experienced veteran. His youth and aggressive tactics had made him a natural leader among his squad, though he had been in the Corps for less than a year. The Marines had developed new tactics specifically for the final assault. They had learned to coordinate flamethrowers, demolitions, and small unit movements in ways that maximized their effectiveness against cave positions. The techniques were dangerous and required precise timing, but they had proven to be the only way to eliminate Japanese defensive positions without suffering prohibitive casualties. As referenced in Bill Hippel's account for Newsweek magazine, the final week of fighting on Iwo Jima represented the culmination of amphibious assault tactics that had been developed over 3 years of Pacific warfare. The Japanese were now facing shortages of ammunition, food, and medical supplies that severely limited their defensive capabilities. However, this desperation only increased their willingness to engage in close-quarters combat where their superior knowledge of the terrain and their acceptance of death could neutralize American advantages in firepower and equipment. Marine casualties during the final week were actually higher than during the initial assault, as the compressed defensive perimeter allowed the Japanese to concentrate their remaining firepower more effectively. Every advance was contested with a ferocity that impressed even veteran Marines who had fought in multiple Pacific campaigns. The end was approaching, but the island would extract its final payment in blood before releasing its grip on the men who had fought so hard to possess it. The battle for Iwo Jima was entering its climactic phase, where individual acts of courage would determine the final outcome of the costliest battle. In Marine Corps History. Part 7, Victories. Prisian, March 26th, 36 days after the first Marines had landed on the black volcanic beaches, organized Japanese resistance on Iwo Jima finally ended. The cost had been staggering, nearly 7,000 American dead and over 19,000 wounded, making it the bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history. Of the 22,000 Japanese defenders, fewer than 200 had survived to be taken prisoner. The final moments of the battle were as brutal as everything that had preceded them. Lieutenant General Kurabayashi, the architect of the island's defense, had been killed in the final week of fighting, though his body was never found among the countless Japanese dead scattered across the volcanic wasteland. His innovative defensive tactics had extracted a price that shocked American military leaders and forced a fundamental reconsideration of future operations against the Japanese home islands. Sergeant John Barcelone, who had been posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions during the assault, represented the kind of individual courage that had characterized the entire campaign. Marines like Barcelone had fought with a tenacity that matched their enemies, refusing to yield ground, even when facing impossible odds. Their sacrifice had secured an island that would serve as a crucial base for the final assault on Japan. The strategic importance of Iwo Jima became apparent even before the fighting ended. American engineers had begun repairing the island's airfields. While battles still raged in the northern sectors, the island would serve as an emergency landing field for damaged B-29 bombers, returning from raids on Japan, ultimately saving thousands of American aircrew lives. The sulfur mines that had given the island its Japanese name would remain closed, their economic value insignificant compared to the military importance of the airfields. Private First Class Ira Hayes, one of the Marines who had raised the flag on Mount Suribachi, struggled to understand the meaning of the victory. The 22-year-old Pima Indian from Arizona had watched too many friends die to feel any satisfaction in the final outcome. Like many veterans of the campaign, Hayes would carry the psychological scars of Iwo Jima for the rest of his life, a reminder that victory in war always comes at a price that extends far beyond the battlefield. The Marine Corps had proven its ability to take any objective, regardless of the cost. But the lessons of Iwo Jima would influence American military planning for decades to come. The battle had demonstrated that Japanese forces, when properly prepared and equipped, could extract a price that made even victory seem like defeat. The projected casualties for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, reached into the millions based on the Iwo Jima experience. The island itself bore the scars of the battle for years afterward. The volcanic soil was so saturated with metal fragments that it was dangerous to walk in many areas. Unexploded ordnance would claim additional lives long after the fighting ended, as the island slowly reclaimed the weapons of war that had been left behind. The sulfur springs that had given Iwo Jima its name continued to bubble through the volcanic rock, indifferent to the human drama that had played out on its surface. As documented in Time magazine's retrospective coverage, the battle for Iwo Jima had demonstrated both the courage of individual Marines and the terrible cost of amphibious warfare against a determined enemy. The survivors of the battle would carry its memory for the rest of their lives. Many found it difficult to speak about their experiences, unable to convey the horror and intensity of the fighting to those who had not been there. The bonds formed between Marines on Iwo Jima would endure long after the war ended, united by their shared experience of surviving one of history's most brutal battles. The flag that had been raised on Mount Suribachi became a symbol of American determination, and sacrifice. But those who had been there understood that the true monument to the battle was not the photograph or the memorial statues that would follow. The real monument was the memory of the men who had fought and died on the volcanic wasteland, paying the price for victory with their blood and their lives. Iwo Jima had been taken, but the island had extracted its payment in full. The 8 square miles of volcanic rock and sulfur springs had cost more American lives than any battle in Marine Corps' history, a price that would be remembered long after the strategic importance of the island had faded into historical footnote. The battle had ended, but its legacy would endure as long as men remembered the cost of courage and the price of victory.